Now we move into the second chapter, which is the creative narrative, the creation narrative, going into the Bible substance itself after the introduction. Now, okay, I need to shift, stop, share, and share. All right, I'm gonna break this video into sections so that it doesn't become like one long video. So the first part here that we're going to talk about is the introduction to the Torah and the first part of our study. So the inquiry questions we have 4 questions. What's the place of the 5 books of Moses among the other books? Is it comes as the top of them? Is it equal with the other books? Is the Bible all equally important and holy and all that? Or there's a certain steps that one taken over the other? For example, when we do this in the New Testament, you come to the church and it's the readings. What happens if you come at the door and the gospel is read? You don't move. Everybody's standing. We light candles. Abuna says a litany. But what if you come and it's St. Paul that is read? We sit down, we relax, and we listen. What if the sermon? Same way. So the gospel has a very, very high, we give it a high esteem. Why is that? Because it's Jesus speaking to us. When the apostles speak to us, we relax a little bit. Same thing in the Torah, in the Old Testament. The Torah is where God gives Moses the law and he shows himself. But what after the Torah comes the prophets and the history? The Jews in the synagogue would stand up for the Torah, would light candles, and would pay a high attention to the Torah and say the 5 books of Moses. But when it comes to the history and the prophets, they relax a little bit. So what is the place of the Torah in relationship to the rest of the Bible? What are the main themes of Genesis, the book of Genesis? 50 chapters, what are the main themes? We need to know them. God created man to be in a covenant with God. We talked about the covenant, that was the main theme. Can we find proofs in Genesis 1 and 2? So in this session, we'll talk about the covenant with Adam and Eve, the first covenant with humans. The last question we're going to try to answer is the meaning of good, evil, image, likeness. Tanin, we'll keep it to next time. Sabbath is this time, nakedness next time. And Sabbath will be this time. We have a hope that we have read chapter 1 and 2 as a preparation, so that I'm not going to read them for you. It's going to take us forever to keep reading the Bible. I hope that I come with the assumption that we already read the portions that we assigned every week. The first section of this second chapter is the Pentateuch, the Torah. Where do you find the narrative? We said this before. The story is found in Genesis. Starts in Genesis, it continues to Exodus, and it continues to Exodus 24, but then from Exodus 25 to 50, from Exodus 25 to 50, and then the first 10 chapters in Numbers has to do with the tabernacle. They call it, just bear with me, the tabernacle narrative, meaning the details of this tent of meeting where God is going to meet Israel. This detail was given when the tabernacle was pitched at the foot of Mount Sinai. So between 25 all the way to the end of Exodus, and then the first chapters, 10 chapters of Numbers are called the tabernacle narrative. Although you call them narrative, but they're not story. They're just telling you details of the tabernacle. Got that? That's why I don't count them with the narrative books. When I say narrative books, I'm talking about a story. These 25 and 1035 chapters are not a story. They are actually an explanation, details of the tabernacle. So the authorship and titles of the books, the authorship is given to Moses, except very few verses at the end. And this is in Deuteronomy. Expect those verses to speak about the death of Moses, Moses dying. and he's being buried. And nobody knows where he's buried. Nobody's seen where he was buried. It seems like God has arranged his burial so that the Jews, the Israelites, don't take his body and keep worshiping him. We have a tendency, humans have a tendency to do that with people after they die, if they were done a great work. That's Genesis, the book of beginnings. It's a narrative book. The Hebrew word for Genesis is Parashit, means in the beginning. In the Hebrew titles of the books, for your info, the title of the book is the first word of the book. If the book says in the beginning, at the beginning of the book it says in the beginning, then the book name would be in the beginning. So where is this Genesis coming from? From the Septuagint. Septuagint have given different titles to the book. The next book is Exodus. It's all narrative. Very little stuff that's not narrative. Exodus is the book of Israel formation and redemption to make their identity. Narrative for the first chapter to chapter 24. That's what we said. Actually, 24, not 25. To 24, 1 to 24 is a story. Straight story. You want to read the story? Read Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 50. Exodus 1, all the way to 24. You have a perfect story. But where are you going to continue with the story? Jump over the second part of Exodus and over the 10 chapters of Numbers and start at chapter 11 of Numbers and finish Numbers. Leviticus. It's a non-narrative. It's the handbook of the priest. It's a book made for the priests to do their duties. You're talking about the tabernacle? That's the church. So you need the priest to have some instruction. It's like our Khulagi, our Sanriya, whatever you have, the church books. So that Leviticus is the same. It's made of two pieces. Quickly, the first half of it, maybe 11 chapters, is about what the priest should do in the tabernacle. The bigger half, I think it's about another 17 or 20 chapters, are for sanctifying the people. So dealing with the tabernacle is the first part. Dealing with the people to make them holy is the second part of it. Numbers, the book of the desert wandering, it contains 3 censuses, 3 counts. And the name of this book is by Midbar, means in the wilderness, in the desert. Why they are calling it Numbers? That's Septuagint naming, meaning there had to be numbers. There had to be some counts. 3 counts. 2, one at the beginning, one at the end, exactly the same. And one small numbering happened at chapter 3. Very significant numbering. We come to this and I'm going to tell you about them. But remember, the book of Numbers are called Numbers because of censuses, counting. 3 counts, 2 big ones, and a small one at chapter 3. Deuteronomy, which the Septuagint name mean second law, the second law. This is the second rendering. Moses is giving them the law again. So he gave them the law at Mount Sinai. Now they finished the 40 years wandering. They're about to enter the promised land. Moses is giving the law again. But this time, the whole book of Deuteronomy is 3 long speeches. Moses gave one speech, and the shortest of them is the first one. A second one is very close to it. The third one is long. And in each of those speeches, he speaks about the law. He gives a little bit of the history and reflection on the history of what happened, and then he gives the law. It's called the second law. And it's non-narrative. It's just memories and commentaries. There's no new stories happening in Deuteronomy. The Torah is the holiest part of the Bible. In fact, the rest of the Bible books builds on the Torah as foundation, where the law is given. The Bible books of history use the Torah as the standard against which the Israelites and their leaders are judged. You would read this in history, and this king did not heed the law of God, and he was an evil king. He might be the greatest architect, he might be the greatest politician, but because he didn't listen to the law of God, what happens? He's considered as bad. In the book of Judges, and the people forsook the law of God. and God delivered them to their enemies, and their enemies subdued them, and they tortured them. You would see in Gideon, they used to steal their food. Their enemies come and steal their food. Imagine after harvesting, after planting and sowing, and then a time of reaping, they get it and they start threshing it, and the dust start to come up, and people from far can see the dust. They know they're collecting their grain. It's our time. They go either burn it or steal it. So they were tortured in the book of Judges. Why? Because they had not followed the Torah. They had not followed the law of God. It's going to continue all the way to the exile. Almost all the prophets warned the people of God, and sometimes other nations, when the laws of God written in the Pentateuch were broken. Pentateuch means the 5 books. That's the Torah. The Greek word for Torah is Pentateuch. The books of poetry and wisdom sang of God's commandment and precepts. You have one perfect example. Just don't want you to forget that. Psalm 119, which is the long psalm. You're familiar with it, that we read it in midnight? The first watch of midnight, we have a very long psalm. Every single verse is 160 some verses. Every single verse is a serenade, a love song in the commandments of God. You would have one of those statutes, commandments, words, instructions, all these synonyms of the commandments of God. It's in this very long psalm. So the Psalms have sung of the word of God, of the Pentateuch. The books of poetry and wisdom saying God's commandments and precepts. So let's start with Genesis. So the Torah is a very special place in the Bible. You understand the Torah, that's why we're going to take in much more time in the Torah than in other book. Because if without you getting familiar with the Torah, the rest of the Bible becomes very mysterious and disconnected. They're like different stories that doesn't make sense. Genesis, the main themes, and then we're going to talk about main themes, includes events, very major events. We're talking about the second theme, which is covenants. And the third theme is the life of patriarchs. Patriarchs means father of fathers, fathers of fathers. The great grandfathers of the Israelites and of the church. So 3 things we're studying as themes: events, covenants, and patriarchs. We have a little table here that you can see the events, very simple table. How many events we have? 4 in Genesis, 4 events. What are the events? Creation, that's a major event. It explains why everything exists. The second one is the fall. That explains why there is evil in the world. The third event is the flood, why there is no more evil in the world. And the fourth one is the nations, why we have different nations, different tongues, and different languages. These 4 things are the events: creation, fall, flood, nations. Creation, chapter 1 and 2, fall, chapter 3, flood, chapter 6 to 9, nations, chapter 10. Very early. Those events happens in the first 1/5 of the book of Genesis. The covenants, we have 3 covenants, major ones, especially Abraham. Adam, Noah, and Abraham. We call the covenant by the mediator. The mediator of the first covenant is Adam. The second one is Noah. The third one is Abraham. Abraham, in many ways, is the covenant of all covenants. I'll tell you about it when you come. Abraham is a very significant covenant. You should never miss understanding covenant with Abraham. This is the covenant. Actually, Christ's covenant is a fulfillment of Abraham's covenant. Imagine. The patriarchs are 4. Abraham, his son Isaac, grandson Jacob, great-grandson Joseph. Those are 4 patriarchs that actually can divide the book of Genesis after the events. After you finish the events, you can divide the rest by the patriarchs. For example, we said creation is first and second chapters. Fall, 3. Flood, 6 to 9. How about nations? 10. Abraham comes at chapter 12. He is brought into the story of Genesis at chapter 12. and ends the story at chapter 25. At the same time, Isaac overlapped Abraham and Jacob. But Jacob starts at chapter 25 and ends in chapter 50. All right? So you have, and Joseph overlapped the last part of Jacob. Okay? Now, I'm going to hold it here, and we can, for purpose of cutting, we have to stop here and start the second piece of this chapter. Any questions about this part? Okay.